She stood at the edge of the ballroom, invisible. The candlelight fell softly on the other women, the ones whose husbands touched their elbows, leaned close to whisper, smiled with their eyes. Eleanor Ashworth, Duchess of Ashworth, held a glass of champagne she had not tasted, and felt the weight of her own silence like a stone on her chest. Across the room, her husband stood near the terrace doors, his dark head bent toward Lady Cecily Morningside. He laughed quietly at something she said. Eleanor had not heard him laugh in the 8 months of their marriage. He had never once looked at her the way he was looking at Cecily now, warm, open, interested. She was his wife, but in that moment she was less than a stranger. She was a ghost in a silk gown, and no one would meet her eyes. He did not cry. She had learned very quickly not to cry. She set the glass down on a passing tray and walked toward the terrace herself, not because she wanted to be near him, but because she needed air. As she passed, the Duke's gaze flickered to her for half a second, then moved away. No acknowledgement, no nod, nothing. Her skirts whispered against the marble floor, and she stepped out into the cool night alone. The laughter of the ballroom faded behind her. She gripped the stone balustrade and breathed. Somewhere inside her, a small voice said what she had been too afraid to think. He would never love her. She had been waiting for something that would never come. That was the moment the waiting ended. That was the moment the Duchess began to change. She had come to this marriage with hope. That was the cruelest part. 8 months earlier, Eleanor Whitfield had stood in the drawing room of her family's modest estate, her mother's hand smoothing her hair, her father's voice telling her she would be a duchess. She had not known the Duke of Ashworth personally. She had seen him once from a distance at a county assembly, tall, reserved, impossibly handsome in a severe way. When her father told her the match was arranged, she felt a flutter of something she dared to call fate. She imagined quiet conversations by the fire, a slow unfolding of trust, perhaps affection. She was 22, gently raised, a little shy but full of quiet feeling. She had spent her girlhood reading poetry and helping the tenants, children, learn their letters. She believed goodness was always rewarded. The wedding was small and swift. Alexander Ashworth, the 6th Duke of Ashworth, spoke his vows without looking at her. His voice was cold, correct, hollow. At the wedding breakfast, he stood apart from her, speaking only when protocol demanded. That night in the grand carriage that carried them to Ashworth Hall, he sat opposite her in absolute silence, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed out the window. Eleanor's hands trembled in her lap. She told herself he was simply reserved. She told herself he needed time. The first weeks at Ashworth Hall were a slow, polite form of dying. The house was immense, gray stone wrapped in ancient ivy, corridors that echoed, rooms that swallowed her small presence. The staff was efficient and distant. The Duke was rarely home, and when he was, he treated her with an exquisite, suffocating courtesy. He inquired after her health. He asked if her rooms were comfortable. He never raised his voice. He never stayed in a room with her longer than necessary. He looked through her as if she were a piece of furniture he had acquired and did not particularly admire. She would set out a book in the library, hoping he might join her by the fire, but he would see her there and quietly retreat. At dinner, they sat at opposite ends of a table made for 30, the clink of silverware echoing between them. He never asked about her day. He never asked about her family. He never asked anything at all. She tried, oh how she tried. She learned his favorite foods and asked the cook to prepare them. He ate without comment. She placed fresh flowers in his study. He never mentioned them. She wore a gown the color of bluebells because his valet once mentioned he favored blue. He did not notice. She asked gentle questions about his estate, his interests, his boyhood. His answers were clipped, 1 or 2 words, never an opening. It was like pushing a heavy door that was bolted from the other side. After a while, the effort began to hurt less, and that frightened her. She started to feel a numbness spreading where hope used to live. Then came the first ball as a married couple, the one where she stood invisible. She had worn her finest gown, silver-gray silk that made her dark hair gleam, pearls at her throat. She had walked into Ashworth Hall's grand ballroom on her husband's arm, but the moment they entered, he released her. He melted into the crowd and she was left alone. She watched him dance with Cecily Morningside twice. She watched him smile. She heard the whispers, how beautiful Lady Cecily looked, how the Duke seemed more himself tonight. What a shame he had married so suddenly, poor man, and no one knew why. No one said anything directly about Alina, but the silence around her was louder than any words. She was the Duchess, yet she was invisible. Later that night, back in her chamber, she sat before the mirror and unpinned her hair with slow, deliberate movements. Her lady's maid, a kind young woman named Betsy, said nothing, but her eyes were full of pity. Alina could not bear pity. She dismissed her gently and sat alone in the dark. The cold truth settled around her heart. She had been married to a title, to a duty, to a man who resented her very presence. She did not know why. She only knew she could not keep bleeding in silence. The next morning she did something different. She did not arrange flowers. She did not consult the cook. She put on a plain wool dress, covered her hair with a simple bonnet, and walked out of the great house alone. The estate stretched for miles, but she had heard of a village orphanage on the far edge of the Duke's land, a place that needed help. She had always been good with children. If she could not be a wife, perhaps she could still be useful. The orphanage was a narrow, drafty building with peeling paint and the smell of boiled cabbage. It was run by a weary woman named Mrs. Hatch, who had more children than funds and no time for polite formalities. Alina introduced herself simply as Mrs. Ashworth, omitting her title, and asked if she could volunteer. Mrs. Hatch looked at her fine shoes and clean hands, then shrugged. "We need someone to teach the little ones their letters and numbers. They're wild, mind. Not one of them can sit still." Alina smiled, a real smile, her first in months, and said, "I think I can manage." And so she began. Every morning she walked the 2 miles to the orphanage, rain or cold, and spent hours with the children. There was a boy of 5 named Tom who had lost both parents to fever, and a girl of 8 named Lily who drew pictures of birds in the margins of old newspapers. There was a baby, a little scrap of a thing, who would only stop crying when Alina held her. The children did not know she was a duchess. They did not care about her title or her cold husband or the whispers at balls. They needed her hands to tie shoelaces, her voice to read stories, her arms to hold them when they cried. And she needed them, more than she had ever needed anything. They gave her a reason to get out of bed. They reminded her that she still had a heart, even if it was battered. The Duke did not notice her absences at first. He was consumed with estate business and his own private world of which she was not a part. Days passed and he did not ask where she went. It stung, but she was growing a protective callus. She told herself it did not matter. She stopped waiting for him to come to dinner. She ate early in the kitchen with the servants, who gradually warmed to her, or she ate nothing at all. She stopped setting out books in the library. She stopped hopping. A month later, the first crack appeared in the Duke's indifference. It was a Tuesday evening, and he happened to return home earlier than usual. He walked into the drawing room, expecting to find her there with her embroidery as she had always been. The room was empty. He frowned. He walked to the morning room. Empty. The library, empty. A strange, unfamiliar unease stirred in his chest. He rang for the butler, Mr. Finch, and inquired with careful neutrality, "Where is Her Grace?" Mr. Finch hesitated. "I believe the Duchess is at the orphanage in Millwood, Your Grace. She has been spending her days there for some weeks now." The Duke's expression did not change, but something flickered behind his eyes. "The orphanage, I see." He dismissed the butler and stood alone in the silent house. She had been going to the orphanage for weeks, and he had not known, he had not noticed. The unease deepened, settling into something sharper. He poured himself a brandy and drank it too fast. He did not like the feeling at all. The next day he did something he rarely did. He sought her out. He rode to Millwood under the pretense of inspecting a tenant farm nearby, but his true purpose was a pull he could not name. He dismounted a short distance from the orphanage and stood in the shadow of a large oak, watching. Through a grimy window he saw her. She was sitting on a low stool, a child on her lap, 2 more clustered at her feet, a book open in her hand. Her hair was coming loose from its pins, and there was a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She was reading aloud, her face soft and animated. He had never seen that expression on her face, not once, not directed at him. The child on her lap laughed and tugged her sleeve, and she laughed too, a bright, clear sound that carried through the glass. Alexander Ashworth felt something twist inside him. It was not jealousy yet, but it was the beginning of awareness. She was not the silent, fatting creature he had left each morning. She was alive here, in a way she had never been with him, and he had never given her the chance. He rode home before she could see him. That evening he arrived in the dining room to find her already seated, a book beside her plate. She looked up, surprised to see him. "Your Grace, I was not expecting you." He took his seat. "I am aware that I have been absent." The words felt foreign, too small for the enormity of his neglect. "I understand you have been occupied with charitable work." Aliner's gaze was steady, but there was a new distance in it. "Yes, the orphanage needed assistance. It gives me purpose." Purpose? She said it simply, without accusation, but it struck him like a lash. He had given her no purpose. He had given her a cold house and colder silence. He cleared his throat. "I am glad you have found an outlet." He wanted to say more, but the words stuck. They ate the rest of the meal in silence, but this time he watched her. She ate little, and when she excused herself, she did not linger. She did not hope. She simply left, and he felt the absence like a door closing. Weeks passed and the pattern shifted. The Duke began to come home earlier. He began to notice the small things, the way she smiled at the housekeeper, the way she hummed under her breath when she thought no one could hear, the way she always paused to touch the petals of the roses in the garden. He noticed, too, the way she no longer looked at him with that quiet, expectant hope. Her eyes were calm now, serene, completely self-contained. It unnerved him. He had grown accustomed to her silent longing. Its disappearance left an emptiness he could not define. He found himself lingering in doorways, trying to think of something to say. Once, he asked if the orphanage needed any supplies. She answered politely, thanked him for the inquiry, and said she had already arranged everything. She did not need his help. She did not need him. The realization unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. One afternoon he rode to Millwood again, this time openly. He found her in the small garden behind the orphanage, trying to mend a broken trellis while 3 children helped by handing her the wrong tools. She was laughing again, her hands dirty, her bonnet askew. She saw him and stilled. The laughter died. The children stared at the tall, stern man in fine clothes. "Your Grace," she said, rising and brushing off her skirt. "Is something wrong?" "No." He stepped closer, feeling absurdly out of place. "I thought I might see the orphanage. I have heard good things." She hesitated, then nodded. "Of course, I will show you around." She led him through the cramped rooms, introducing him to Mrs. Hatch and the children. He stood stiffly, unused to such surroundings, and the children eyed him warily. Little Tom asked loudly, "Is he your husband, miss?" Aliner flushed. "Yes, Tom, this is the Duke of Ashworth." Tom squinted. "He looks cross." Aliner bit her lip, and to Alexander's astonishment, a laugh escaped her. It was a small laugh, stifled but real. She glanced at him, and for one unguarded moment their eyes met. Something electric passed between them, something that had never been there before. Then she looked away, and the moment was gone. On the ride home he was silent, but his mind churned. She had laughed. She had almost laughed with him. It felt like a gift, brief and precious. He realized with a pang that he wanted to make her laugh again. He wanted to be the reason for that light in her eyes, but he had no idea how. Then Mr. Thomas Harrow entered their lives. Thomas Harrow was the new physician in the village, a young man with kind eyes and gentle hands. He had come from London, seeking a quieter life, and he began visiting the orphanage weekly to check on the children. Aliner liked him immediately. He was warm, unpretentious, and he treated her not as a duchess but as a fellow volunteer. They fell into easy conversation about the children's health, about books, about the simple pleasures of the countryside. Thomas had a way of making her feel seen, not as a title but as a person. He would save her a cup of tea when she arrived, remember which child had a cough, ask after her day with genuine interest. It was the kind of ordinary kindness she had craved for so long. The Duke did not know about Thomas Harrow until the day of the village fair. It was a modest affair, held on the green, with stalls and games and a maypole. Alina had helped organize it to raise funds for the orphanage. She was there early, hanging ribbons with the children, her face flushed with exertion and happiness. The Duke had been persuaded to attend by his steward, who thought it good for the estate's image. He arrived to find a scene that stopped him mid-stride. Alina stood near the maypole, laughing at something a tall, fair-haired man was saying. The man was leaning a little too close, his hand brushing her sleeve. She looked up at him with an ease and warmth that Alexander had never been granted. The Duke's entire body went rigid. He recognized the feeling now, jealousy pure and scalding. It surged through him, irrational and absolute. He wanted to stride across the green, plant himself between them, and demand to know who this man was. But he had no right. He had no claim on her smiles. He had refused them for months. So he stood frozen, his hands clenched at his sides, and watched his wife give to another man what she had once tried to give to him. Later he found her alone by the refreshment table. "Who was that man?" he asked, his voice sharper than intended. Alina looked up, startled. "That is Dr. Harrow. He assists at the orphanage. He has been very helpful." "I am sure he has." The words were clipped, edged with something dark. He seemed quite familiar. She tilted her head, studying him with those calm, distant eyes. "He is a friend, Your Grace. I am grateful for his company." Company? She was grateful for another man's company because her husband gave her none. The blow was silent but devastating. He had no defense. He stood there, the weight of his failures pressing down on him, and said nothing. She waited a moment, then inclined her head and walked away. He watched her go, and for the first time he felt a sharp, distinct fear. He was losing her. No, he had already lost her. She had simply stopped fighting for something he had never given. That night he sat alone in his study, staring into the fire. He thought of her face at the fete, the way she had smiled at Harrow. He thought of the early days of their marriage, the way she had set out those books, the flowers she had placed on his desk. He had never thanked her. He had never even acknowledged them. He had been so consumed with his own bitterness that he had crushed every tender shoot she offered. Why? Because he had believed a lie, because he had been too proud to question what he thought he knew. The truth of their marriage had been a carefully guarded secret, but it was time to face it. Alexander's father, the fifth Duke, had been a reckless man who gambled away a fortune and left the estate teetering on the edge of ruin. Just before his death, he had secretly borrowed a massive sum from a wealthy merchant, Alina's father, Mr. Whitfield. The debt was enormous, and the late Duke had offered a promise. If the debt could not be repaid, a marriage between the families would settle it. Alexander had known nothing of this until after his father's death, when Whitfield came to him with the papers and a quiet, ruthless ultimatum. If Alexander did not marry Alina, Whitfield would expose the late Duke's financial crimes and ruin the family name forever. There would be scandal, disgrace, perhaps even the loss of Ashworth Hall. Alexander, barely 26 and newly burdened with the title, had seen no choice. He agreed to the marriage, but he believed Alina must have known. He believed she was part of the scheme, a willing tool of her ambitious father. He had married her with resentment burning in his heart, and he had punished her for a crime she had never committed. The truth was, Alina knew nothing. Her father had told her only that the Duke had sought the match, that it was a great honor. She had been a dutiful daughter, trusting and naive. She had come to Ashworth Hall with an open heart, completely ignorant of the blackmail that had sealed her fate. She had no idea that her husband's coldness was born of a belief that she had trapped him. She only knew she was unloved, and it was slowly killing something inside her. Alexander sat in the dark and let the full weight of his guilt press down. He had never asked her. He had never given her the chance to speak. He had condemned her without a trial. And now he watched her slip away, finding solace in an orphanage and friendship with a doctor who saw her worth. The jealousy that had flared earlier now mingled with a deeper, more terrifying emotion, regret. He regretted every cold glance, every silence, every dinner eaten in lonely grandeur. He regretted the flowers he had ignored and the books he had never opened. He regretted the wife he had refused to know. He tried in the days that followed to mend things. He began with clumsy, halting gestures. He left a new set of children's books for the orphanage on her sitting room table. Alina found them and sent a polite note of thanks, but it was formal, distant. No warmth. He asked her to ride with him one morning and she agreed, but she rode in silence, her eyes on the horizon, not on him. He attempted to ask about her day, and she answered briefly, then lapsed into quiet. She was not unkind, she was simply absent. She had built a wall around her heart and he could not find a door. The breaking point came on a cold, rainy night. Alina had stayed late at the orphanage, helping a child with a fever. The Duke, growing restless, had waited in the hall, watching the clock. When an hour passed and she did not return, he ordered his horse and rode out into the storm, a terrible anxiety clawing at his chest. He found the road dark and treacherous, and near the bridge over the swollen stream, he saw a fallen lantern and a carriage wheel broken. His heart stopped. He spurred his horse forward and found the small cart the orphanage used overturned on the bank. And there, half in the water, was Alina, clinging to a tree root, her face pale with shock and cold. He did not think. He threw himself from the horse, plunged into the icy water, and pulled her free. She was trembling violently, her dress soaked, a gash on her forehead. He carried her to the bank and wrapped her in his coat, his hands shaking. "Alina," he said, her name breaking from his lips like a prayer. "Stay with me, please." Her eyes fluttered open, dazed. "The children, are they safe?" "They are safe," he said, though he did not know. Later he learned the driver had taken them another way home before the accident. In that moment all that mattered was her. He held her against his chest, and for the first time he let himself feel the full depth of his terror. He could have lost her. He could have lost her without ever telling her the truth, without ever making amends. She might have died believing he did not care. The thought shattered him. He carried her home through the rain, refusing to let anyone else touch her. He stayed by her bedside all night, watching the rise and fall of her breath, his jaw set, his eyes red-rimmed. When she woke the next morning, weak but alive, she found him there, still in his wet clothes, his hand gripping hers. "You are safe," he said, his voice rough. "You are safe and I am here." Alina looked at him and something in her guarded expression softened. It was not forgiveness yet, but it was a crack in the wall. "You came for me," she whispered. "Always," he said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "From now on, always." The days of her recovery were a strange, tender interlude. The Duke took personal charge of her care, dismissing the hovering servants, bringing her broth and tea himself. He read to her from a book of poetry he found in her room, his voice halting at first, then steadier. He did not speak of grand things. He simply stayed. And slowly Alina began to see a different man, the man she had hoped existed, the man beneath the ice. She was cautious, though. Her heart had been bruised too often. She did not dare to trust it yet. One afternoon, when she was strong enough to sit in the garden, he sat on the stone bench beside her and took a deep breath. It was time. "Alina, I must tell you something. Something I should have told you before we ever said our vows." She turned to him, her eyes questioning, but she said nothing. He told her everything: the debt, her father's blackmail, the threat of scandal, and the terrible, unjust conclusion he had drawn, that she had known that she was part of it. "I punished you," he said, his voice thick with shame. "I was cruel and cold, and you did nothing to deserve it. You were innocent. You were always innocent, and I was too blind to see it." She was silent for a long time. Her hands lay still in her lap. When she spoke, her voice was very quiet. "I never knew. Father told me you had chosen me. I thought you simply found me wanting. I spent months trying to understand what I had done wrong." The words cut him deeper than any blade. "You did nothing wrong, nothing. I was a fool and a coward. I blamed you because facing the truth that your father had me trapped was easier than admitting I was powerless." He turned to her, his eyes desperate. "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I need you to know that my heart has changed. It has awakened. I see you now, Alina. I see the woman who gives herself to orphan children, who laughs in the dirt, who endures loneliness with grace. I see you, and his voice broke. I love you too late, but I love you completely." The words hung in the air, heavy and trembling. Alina stared at him, and for a moment she was transported back to the young woman who had once dreamed of such a confession. But she was not that woman anymore. She had been forged by pain into something stronger. She knew now that love was not a desperate hope. It was a choice, a gift that must be freely given. She could choose to stay in her fortress of self-protection, or she could risk her heart again. She reached out and took his hand. "It is not too late," she said softly, "but it will take time. You broke something in me, Alexander. I need to know that this is not born of guilt or fear. I need to know it is real." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her fingers. "I will spend the rest of my life proving it. I will wait as long as you need." And so the healing began. It was not a sudden, sweeping romance. It was a slow unfurling like winter giving way to spring. He learned to be patient. He courted his own wife. He brought her small gifts, not jewels but a new slate for the orphanage, a ribbon she had admired in the village shop. He walked with her to Millwood and sat awkwardly on a tiny chair, letting the children climb on him while she hid her smile. He even found himself in conversation with Dr. Thomas Harrow, and though the jealousy still flickered, he forced himself to be civil, to recognize that Harrow had been a friend when Alina had none. Harrow, for his part, was gracious, and when he saw the change between the Duke and Duchess, he quietly stepped back, his affection for Alina translating into respect for her happiness. Alina watched her husband's transformation with guarded hope. She saw him struggle against his own nature, saw him stumble and try again. She began bit by bit to let him in. She told him about her childhood, her love of the sea, her secret fear of thunderstorms. He listened, really listened, and remembered every detail. One evening when a storm raged outside, he came to her sitting room without being asked, carrying a lamp and a book. "I thought you might not want to be alone," he said. She said nothing, but she moved over on the settee to make room for him, and they sat side by side, the lamp casting a warm glow while the rain lashed the windows. It was a small thing, but to her it was everything. Months later, as summer painted the gardens of Ashworth Hall in gold and rose, the Duke and Duchess hosted a small gathering for the orphanage children. There was a party on the lawn, with games and cakes and laughter. Alina, glowing in a simple muslin dress, chased little Tom around a fountain while the Duke stood at the edge, holding the baby who had once cried for no one but her. The baby, now a plump, contented child, had fallen asleep against his shoulder. Alexander looked across at his wife, her cheeks flushed, her hair escaping its pins, and felt a surge of love so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. This was what he had nearly thrown away. This was the life he had almost forfeited. That night, after the children had gone and the house was quiet, he and Alina walked through the rose garden under a sky thick with stars. He took her hand, and this time she did not pull away. She interlaced her fingers with his. They stopped beneath an arbor heavy with white blooms, and he turned to face her. "I have something to ask you," he said, his voice low. "Not as a duke, not out of duty, just as a man who loves a woman more than he can say." He reached into his pocket and drew out a simple silver ring, not the heavy ancestral piece she wore, but a band etched with tiny roses. "I know we are already married, but I want to ask you again freely. Alina, will you be my wife? Not because of a debt or a bargain, but because you choose me, because you want me." She looked at the ring, then up at his face, and saw there the man she had always believed existed. Her eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of release, not sorrow. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I choose you, Alexander, I choose you." He slipped the ring onto her finger beside the other, and then he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, softly, reverently, the kiss they had both waited a lifetime to share. In that kiss was all the longing, all the pain, all the forgiveness, and all the hope that had brought them to this moment. The stars wheeled above, and the roses breathed their sweet scent into the night, and two hearts that had been so far apart finally, truly became one. It was not a perfect love. It was a love that had been tested and broken and remade, stronger for its scars. And as they walked back to the house, hand in hand, Alina leaned her head against her husband's shoulder and felt, for the first time that she had come home. In the years that followed, the story of the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth became a quiet legend. People spoke not of scandal but of the couple who rebuilt an orphanage, who walked side by side through the village, who looked at each other with a tenderness that made young women sigh. And sometimes, on summer evenings, Elinor would sit on the terrace and remember the night she stood alone in the ballroom, invisible and heartbroken. She would feel Alexander's arm slip around her waist, feel his lips brush her hair, and she would smile. The pain was part of their story, but it was not the end. The end was this, a love that had arrived too late and yet somehow right on time.